Hello, friends. Welcome to Logistics of Logistics podcast. My name is Joe Lynch. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's topic is the CPG supply chain with my friend Mike Baudendistel. Did I say that correctly?
Close enough. Baudendistel.
Baudendistel. All right. Mike, please introduce yourself and your company and where you're calling from today.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Joe, for having me. I'm Mike Baudendistel, head of intermodal solutions at FreightWaves. SONAR. FreightWaves is the largest media company, and which just recently split into FreightWaves, the media company, and SONAR, which is the high frequency data company. So I'm now with the data company, but I still do some on media. There's still plenty to do across both companies. And so I follow the intermodal industry most closely, but also everyone in the company knows the truckload industry really well. We have data on the ocean industry, some even on drayage and LTL. So spend a lot of time with our existing customers, helping them to interpret the data and what it means for their situation.
Yep. Mike, you host a podcast over there. What's the name of that podcast?
The podcast is The Stockout, which I co-host with Grace Sharkey. And that podcast is focused on retail and CPG, consumer packaged goods, logistics, and also the freight markets. So we talk about what's happening in those industries, what we're seeing in the FreightWaves Sonar product. It goes live every Monday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern time, and happy to have others join and listen to it.
Yep. I will make sure I put a link to the Stockout podcast, put that in the show notes. I just saw Grace at FreightWaves. I saw Grace at Manifest. We live like 45 minutes apart. We always say we should be getting together for lunch, but we always see each other at conferences. But SONAR, you guys solve a very specific problem for customers. Everyone knows what FreightWaves does. And I think when a lot of times people go, oh, FreightWaves, and they think it's all about that media company because it has such a big footprint with the conferences and the podcasts and the media, the news. And such a good job there that I think it overshadows, I think, the original mission, which was SONAR. So please talk about what problem does SONAR solve for its customers?
SONAR really solves the problem of not having enough visibility into what's happening in the freight and logistics market. And a lot of the data that's available on freight industry, logistics, transportation is backwards looking. Like a lot of the government data comes out a couple months after the fact. And so it really doesn't tell you what's happening right now, how to position your freight network going forward. And so the FreightWaves data product is on a real-time basis, essentially. So that basically or at least most of the data points, they update every single day, which gives you visibility into what's happening by region, by lane, and across modes. A lot of the other sort of data solutions out there for freight just focus in on one mode. And what we did is want to look at all the different modes to help these large multinational shippers best utilize what's the best mode of transportation for their network.
So are you selling your product to shippers or to the carriers or to the freight brokers and 3PLs?
All of the above and then some. All of those, a lot of financial institutions, a lot of hedge funds will use the data to help with their stock selection, some consulting firms, some government agencies. It really, and then everyone that you mentioned. So it really runs the gamut.
I talked to the economist from FreightWaves or SONAR, I'm not sure which anymore, Anthony?
Yeah, he's no longer there. Yeah, good friend.
Yeah. And I remember him saying about when I talked to him, he said, the financial people, Wall Street's looking at logistics data, especially the stuff you guys provide, because it's a leading indicator. Most of the indicators, I think, are trailing indicators of activity. So if I see a whole bunch of wood being bought in April, I think, well, housing starts. That's my first thought.
Exactly. So a lot of the inputs that will move before the finished product moves, and that'll coincide with freight demand picking up. So it is something that you have financial institutions will look at what's happening with freight volume, tells you what's happening in the physical goods economy, tells me whether I should be more bearish or bullish on, let's say, the industrial economy.
So I was talking to Jason Miller from Michigan State last year, and he said, oh, I don't see enough. He didn't see enough building materials moving in early spring. And right now we're talking March 11th. I don't think we're right about now. And I think a lot of us would like to say, oh, there's a whole bunch of wood moving and a whole bunch of roofing material moving because there's going to be houses. By the way, do you already have insights into that?
Yeah, so we have daily data on the flatbed market. So that's not specifically lumber, although we do have the weekly data that comes out from the American Association of American Railroads. It is specifically on lumber, but we've seen a lot of changes in the flatbed market leading up into the days of the tariffs on the NAFTA countries, specifically out of Portland. So it really suggests that flatbed market has tightened up. Maybe it's just temporary, but right as those tariffs hit.
Yep, time will tell. We'll talk about that in a minute. So, Mike, tell us a little bit about you. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? Some career highlights before you joined the juggernaut that is FreightWaves.
Sure. So I'm from the Chicago area and I went to school at Indiana University in Bloomington, studied finance and accounting. And from there, worked in investment banking in M&A for a couple of years, following industrial companies. And then from there, moved to Baltimore to work for John Larkin at Stifel, worked for him for a number of years as his associate following transportation and logistics stocks, and then had the opportunity to have my own coverage there where I followed the railroads, intermodal companies, companies that manufactured equipment like Trinity Industries manufactures rail cars, other companies that manufacture trucks and truck components or leases the rail cars like GATX or sells the trucks like a Rush Enterprises. I've really seen the transportation from the financial perspective, and it's good training for what I do now because a lot of those same customers that were my customers at Stifel, the sort of buy side institutions, are the same customers that are using the SONAR data to make investment decisions. Yeah, I came over to FreightWaves about 5 years ago. I'm intrigued by how it's a startup culture, just really has a lot of energy, always things to do. And it's been good. Helped the company roll out a new intermodal, data product where we took the partnership with Cass, organized their data in such a way that we developed intermodal data by lane that we feel good about. Intermodal data is a little bit challenging because doesn't have the density that truckload has, but now it makes the tool just more of a multimodal tool.
Yep, yep. FreightWaves has changed everything. I feel like sometimes like they're the center of the freight universe. And I talked to Craig Fuller years ago on the podcast, and I remember him talking about when he had the initial idea for Sonar. It was almost like a futures market. That's what we're talking about a little bit with the Sonar product. And he said the problem was there wasn't up to the minute information on the freight market. And so he said we would write an article, submit it to a magazine, and it would get published 3 weeks later. That's not exactly supportive of a futures market. So Craig, being as ambitious as he is, that I will start a media company that does provide up to the minute insights on and news on this business. And I think we've always had magazines, and the magazines have gone the way of the dodo bird in some respects, but we still have that information online, but I just think we consume it a little different. But really changed the way this whole industry worked.
For sure. So FreightWaves is a site you need to go to every day just to see what's happening. And there's always something that catches your eye, whether it's a show or a clip or an article. And this really helps you keep up to speed on the industries and just really learn about the sectors also that you're not an expert in, because it is a broad range of articles, and challenge you to go and read the sort of the main articles, and but there's something that you learn.
Yeah, and with all the podcasts, What the Truck, and so many others that you guys have over there. I never want to quote the same number because I'm always wrong, but like I remember you guys had up to 13, 15 podcasts. I don't know how many there are now, but what I've noticed is FreightWaves, if there's a hot issue, during COVID, you guys created a podcast all about COVID. And I remember people would come on my podcast and would say, "Hey, I want to talk about COVID." I was like, I don't do stuff like that. We'll talk about it, but I don't want to. There's no COVID show. You guys open up a COVID show over there. And then as soon as COVID wasn't a thing, you closed it. Anyway, let's switch gears and talk about the CPG supply chain. So I feel like sometimes logistics gets thrown in. It's a whole bunch of separate industries that get thrown into a bucket. It's like a catch-all category. CPG to me sometimes feels the same way. We use that term and it means consumer packaged goods, right? CPG. But I'm pulling up an article here. That might include tobacco, toys, pharma, household goods, the stuff you buy at the grocery store, health and beauty aids, and then food and beverage being one of the big dogs in there. But it also includes housewares and appliances, apparel, wine and spirits. It's a huge bucket. And am I right to say it's the stuff that we've traditionally bought at grocery stores or Walmart?
Yeah, it's the stuff you buy every week without giving it a lot of thought, a lot of packaged food, a lot of personal care products.
Doesn't include automotive or housing.
Wouldn't include automotive or housing. My definition maybe wouldn't include some of those categories that you mentioned. Like I don't consider appliances and toys really to be part of it, but the bread and butter would be a company like, Nestle or Coca-Cola or Procter Gamble, just these everyday products.
Yeah. And the biggest companies in the world, some of them are the CPG. So you just mentioned some of them: Coke, Pepsi, Anheuser-Busch, Procter and Gamble, Kraft Heinz. Some of these companies are so much bigger than their original name, right? So when I think of Kraft, I think of Kraft macaroni and cheese, but there's probably dozens and dozens of products within Kraft Heinz now.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a phenomenal number of brands that are under these large corporate umbrellas for sure.
The CPG, for the most part, sells through the retailers. And traditionally, things have changed as we have more e-commerce sales, and some of that is impacting that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you do this podcast called The Stock Out. What is the purpose of that podcast? What kind of topics are you guys covering? Because I'm just trying to understand how to talk to a whole CPG audience.
Yeah. So the purpose is really to think about sort of those industries and the freight market from the shipper's perspective. So many of the people that work at FreightWaves or SONAR came from the truck brokerage industry, which, truck people in truck brokerage tend to do it for a certain number of years and don't want to do it forever. So a lot of them found a home at FreightWaves or SONAR, but wanted to look at the market from the shipper's perspective, even dig into some issues that are just very specific to, let's say, the CPG industry, things like the cocoa prices that have exploded. That wasn't going to touch any of the other sort of content that FreightWaves had, but it's a big deal for someone like Hershey's or Mondelez.
I came from the automotive world, and I can tell you this: automotive is the supply chain. And one way to look at it is the supply chain's the dog, and the tail is logistics. A lot of the time I worked in automotive, I never paid attention to logistics costs. It's 5% of revenue, and there's just bigger fish to fry. There's always bigger problems to solve. And kind of you look and go, there's big companies, established systems, and you don't ever look and go, oh my God, this is such an emergency. And when I moved to the logistics business after 20 some years in automotive, I had a different perspective, which was we're so often focused on, oh my God, I got to save money on my logistics. If you're internal to big CPGs, they don't lose sleep thinking about their logistics costs unless they're in the logistics department.
Yeah, they historically have not had a lot of problems with those. I think that changed with COVID, not just because the cost exploded, but for the first time, they struggled getting the ingredients, struggled to get the trucks to show up, struggled to get the products on the shelves. At one point, the Kraft Heinz CEO said, any given day, there's an ingredient we don't have that we need, or a piece of packaging that we need that we don't have. And so after that, the importance just really got elevated. And I think they've really redoubled their efforts.
Yeah. And I will say this: one of the reasons you wouldn't look at logistics is because there was no easy way to manage it. In the last decade or so, 15 years, whatever it is, transportation management systems became standard. And also now I can put a trend line from like a SONAR in my costs. So now all of a sudden it's just, in the past, purchasing, when I first started in logistics, purchasing didn't get involved with the freight spend because they're like, I don't know what the hell's going on. Let the logistics guys worry about it. Now, from what I understand, you often, for the larger companies, the purchasing guys are there. They're talking about KPIs that they expect. And again, I think part of it because the technology is available, but also the analytics from companies like SONAR is available, because now I can say to my boss and my boss's boss in that big company, here's what the market's doing. And in the past, it was black magic.
Yeah, that's really the goal, is to provide that visibility, help people understand, make good decisions, and change their forecasts quicker than they would otherwise be able to.
So I want to talk to you about a few of the big challenges that you guys are covering over there at the Stockout that the CPG companies are going through. And the first one is we're talking about this before we hit the record button, is inflation. And there's a whole bunch of increased costs within the CPG companies. And of course, they want to pass those costs on to their customers, which is the big retailers. And the big retailers are pushing back. Plus, Mike, please talk about all these private label brands. First of all, what is a private label? And then all the challenges that you're seeing with that inflation and that the battle to keep the costs down and to continue keeping their shelf space in the big retail places.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about following the CPG industry for that show that I do is that I saw the inflation creep into the CPG supply chains far earlier than we saw it in the broader economy. And it was really something that just really, even the days of the lockdown to shortly thereafter, CPG companies, you could see it in their costs, like cost inflating for not just transportation, but certain ingredients. Their labor costs rose rather dramatically. The packaging really rose. So it's on all fronts. They saw all these cost increases, and they went to the retailers to take prices up, and then they went back to them again to take them up again, and they went back to them a third and fourth time. So usually they would maybe set a price. They would revisit it in a year and maybe take it up for some normal degree of inflation, but they were coming back to them once every handful of months. And what we ended up with was a lot of CPG prices that to this day are 30 or 40% more as a retail price than what they were before the pandemic hit. And the retailers have been pretty fed up with just the frequency of these increases and just by how steep they are. And it's not as if the CPG companies were just being greedy. In most cases, their margins were really shrinking, and they were trying to recover some of their margins, what they had before the pandemic. They're still trying to recover their margins in a lot of cases before what they had in the pandemic. So they're still trying to catch up with the rising costs. But the consumers tend to, when they go into a store and they can't believe how much they just spent on groceries or personal care products, they tend to blame the store. They said to say, okay, this Kroger's a bad store. I can't believe it's cost $200 this week for groceries or whatever. And a lot of times the store is on your side. It's really the CPG companies that want to have that $6 box of cereal instead of $3.25 or something. So it's gotten a lot more pushback from the stores. And that's part of why you mentioned the private label brands. A lot of those retailers have been more aggressive in developing private label alternatives, which can typically save the consumer 25 or 30%. And they've definitely taken some share. The private labels have, both because of just consumers having issues with their cost of living, but also just because those products have gotten better as retailers have invested more in those products. So that is an issue for a lot of the big national CPG companies. And then the grocery stores that have been growing the fastest, you think about something like Trader Joe's and Aldi is actually the fastest growing grocery chain. Those are large majority private label.
And I think there's a growing acceptance of the private label brands among consumers. I think maybe when they started a long time ago, it'd be like, oh, this looks like it's going to be lower quality. I think what a lot of us have heard is some of the stuff comes from the same factory, same fields, right? So the idea that what I get from the name brand that does a lot of advertising doesn't mean as much because I go, especially, macaroni and cheese. How hard is it to make macaroni and cheese, right? I'm going to splurge on the craft, of course, but I'm a big shot. but look, there's also this, my own note, and this is what I noticed. It's just about craft macaroni and cheese. It was like the only thing you would buy. Now there's all these healthy choice ones out there. And then there's the generics, the private labels. And I don't think Kraft macaroni and cheese has nearly the name brand recognition that it did, say, 30 years ago when we saw advertisements on TV. The people buying that stuff today say, I don't ever see Kraft macaroni and cheese advertisement.
Yeah, there's been a difference there in terms of the targeting of the advertising. But like you said, there's just a lot more options now. And the market's been segmented. And I think what a lot of these big CPG companies have realized is that if they want their sales to be stable, they need to go up market. And so a lot of the big companies have invested more heavily in the healthy products, which they can charge a premium for. That's been the growth area, in addition to certain sort of other segments, like pet food has been growing very quickly, but there's definitely been a premiumization.
Oh, if you put organic on it or premium, people buy it. I know will buy something organic and sometimes wonder, is it really worth an extra few bucks for these apples? I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah, companies like a Nestle is really invested in their sort of premium products, the healthy products, and gotten rid of and divested some of the areas where they're not a differentiated product. They call it the cut the tail to move the head strategy. Silly name, but solid strategy.
Yep. And I know SONAR and everybody at FreightWaves is very familiar with the term on time and in full, OTIF. And some of the big brands use that, or some of the big retailers use those KPIs to manage their inbound freight. And I heard during COVID that there was sometimes empty shelves and that the retailers were judging their CPG partners on empty shelves. And I think what I've heard, and I have not read this lately, but that certain grocery stores noticed that when we had fewer types of peanut butter on the shelves, we sold more peanut butter. Now, that could be because we're not going out to restaurants. Who knows why? But there was a larger volume of peanut butter sold. And I sometimes think when I go to the grocery store, God, there's just a lot of choices for certain things that I think, I don't know if I need all these, but they keep growing. We like choices.
Yeah, the CPG companies have noticed that too. That was one trend the last several years, is they've reduced the number of SKUs. And they figured that if they reduce the number of SKUs, just focused on the ones that turn the fastest, that's going to be better. They'll have to have less inventory, less cost, all of those things. And they did that for a while, for let's say from 2021 through up until maybe a year or so ago. But now I think they're pivoting a little bit because some of the sales volume is stalled out and they need just a reason to spark a little bit of excitement. So now they're introducing some new products. I'm talking generalizations here, but they're introducing some new products that kind of a little bit different, kind of eye-catching to get people to buy something they wouldn't have otherwise bought.
Yeah, it's, when you think about a CPG company, they depend on shelf space from the big retailers, whether it's Kroger or Costco or any of those. And I told you, but I won't mention the name, but I talked to you about a big CPG company. I was talking to one of the sales guys, and he said, we sell something to Costco. And of course, you have to sell it in the larger, you can't just sell one unit. You have to sell 4 units and all put together. And he said, and the margin is so low on it. And he said, but we don't want to lose our opportunity to get in front of the customer and to work with Costco. And so it's a different calculus for them. And they're not looking and saying, this is where we make a ton of money over at Costco. This is where you say, we have to have our brand as the only brand available because we don't want people trying out our competitors.
Yeah, Costco has very low number of SKUs relative to any of the other retailers. So the idea is maybe they sell one particular product that they can sell at a good cost because it's such high volume, and then the consumer likes it. They want to try the other varieties, where the other varieties are only available at other stores, and they make more margin on those.
What does SKU stand for again?
Stock keeping unit. My copy editor makes me define that, even though it's so ubiquitous. It's like defining ESPN. I mean,
so if you talk about a big store like a Walmart, what do they have, 100,000 SKUs?
Thereabouts, yeah.
And then you go over to a company like Aldi. What do they have?
A lot fewer. I don't know what the number is.
So if you look at certain stores, Aldi, Trader Joe's, Costco have fewer SKUs than the big boys, which is easier to manage. And I think we go to Costco for a different reason than we go to Walmart or Meijer. We go to Kroger for different reasons, maybe, than we go to Trader Joe's. But we've seen a whole bunch of changes. I think I heard Trader Joe's has 80% of their sales is their private labels, which seem to come and go. So you can buy a product there, and then if it doesn't sell, it's just they stop making it.
Yeah, I'm surprised it's only 80%. It's pretty much the whole store, them and all.
And people love it. It's like a cult. I'm in the Costco cult personally, but I do dabble in Trader Joe's.
Yeah, I have one walking distance from me. It's a good value. They have some interesting products. They like the treasure hunt mentality. The only negative thing is that a lot of their stuff spoils in a few days. So you have to just buy a few things, eat them the next couple days.
Yeah. So it's when I was a kid, many moons ago, there was grocery stores and there was Walmart. So there was Walmart, but they weren't around here. They were always in small towns far away. And what's changed in my lifetime is we've seen big box stores like the Walmarts pop up, but also Myers, where I live in Michigan. I think it's just the Midwest. And those are big. I think Walmart's the leading grocery store company. Am I right to say that?
They're certainly the largest grocery store. That's right. And so from the CPG perspective, they're about a 20 to 25% customer.
Yep. And so Walmart comes out of nowhere. Then we have Meijer again at stores like that. Then we have Costco. I grocery shop at Costco, but then we have Trader Joe's. That's new. Whole Foods is new. I know I'm missing a few. Aldi is the fastest growing grocery company, and again, there are a lot of private labels. And you said I think it's 25% cheaper to shop at Aldi.
Yeah.
I know I have family members who swear to Aldi. I go there every once in a while, but it's not my top. That's not my top shop. But basically, getting back to the major point here, we've seen inflation, and the retailers have pushed back on the CPGs, saying, "Hey, you can't keep raising prices. You're hurting both of us." I'm sure the CPGs are saying, "Yeah, we're just doing the best we can," and maybe in reaction to that, we're seeing some private labels pop up. And again, I believe consumers' acceptance of private labels has grown enormously in the last generation.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. Yeah, it summarizes the challenges there, but in one word, it's like the consumers are under pressure, and the average consumer is struggling. I would say not necessarily the person that has a huge stock portfolio, even though it's less than it was a week ago, but so the average person, I think, is cutting back.
Everybody looked at their stock portfolio this morning and said, maybe I am an Aldi guy. Getting back to the next point here, before we hit the record button, I was asking you some questions, and you said huge demographic changes has driven a whole bunch of different buying behaviors. That's obviously a massive topic, but talk about that for a minute.
Sure. So the fastest growing segment in CPG has actually been pet food, which I think is a reflection of people having fewer children and more pets. There was a lot of pet adoption during the pandemic because people were at home, but I think it was a category, a trend that was beyond that. There's a sort of human nature to want to take care of something. And if you know, if kids, maybe a pet. So you're seeing growth in pet food overall. And then within pet food, a shift towards the healthier pet food, even like fresh types of pet food. And then within just, human food, a shift towards healthier products there too. Those are more expensive products. Certain demographic can afford that. So really the areas that have been growing the fastest are pet food and healthy foods. The ones that are growing a little bit slower were the ones that are indulgences, like when Smucker bought Hostess a year or so ago. Wall Street hated it because they thought that was just you're buying a dinosaur, an area that's not growing, and we'll probably get into it, but it could be exacerbated by all these GLP-1 drugs that impact people's cravings. So that's having a big difference. Some of the younger generation just, I think, has different purchasing behavior. Also, it seems like Gen Z is not terribly into drinking. You mentioned Anheuser-Busch being one of the largest CPGs. Certainly they are, but it seems like Gen Z, I don't know if it's because it's not cool for their generation, or because they have other types of indulgences, or they've just known too many people who have overdone it, but they seem to be purchasing less alcohol. So some of the companies have pivoted to have non-alcoholic offerings, or things like maybe certain types of sparkling water and juices instead of your Coca-Cola.
Yeah, it's changed a lot. I drink Diet Coke, and young people don't drink Diet Coke. That's I don't know if you've seen like some of their commercials. Remember how cool your mom was? She used to drink Diet Coke back in the day. They're trying to convince um, us that it's cool. If your dad's drinking, if your mom's drinking, it's sometimes hard to convince the kids that's cool. So some of the big hits, baby food, because we're not having as many babies, but also I would say traditional dog food. When I was a kid, nobody worried about the nutrition of the dog. We didn't worry about the nutrition of us. So I will say this. I heard Jerry Seinfeld making fun of this not so long ago. One of his stand-up performances, he said, we never used the word nutrition. I don't think it came up until the 80s. And it was nutrition was a fringe things that maybe the hippies did. Now it's mainstream. And so if I can buy something healthier, I'm going to buy something healthier. That's a lot of us are going to make that call. A lot less drinking, a lot less baby food, a lot less cereal. Cereal's taking a hit because people are like, maybe all these carbs at breakfast isn't the best idea. I I love cereal. I hate the idea that I should be eating it.
Yeah, I think it's not something a lot of parents want to fill their kids up with the sugary cereal first thing in the morning. I think that's, you're right, going away, or at least going towards healthier cereals.
Yeah, and I think I've said this to you before. When when I was growing up, we just wanted calories. Nobody talked about like healthy calories. You just were like, hey, I got a family, I got to feed them. They have to get enough calories. Now I think the expectation is we're looking for the healthiest food we can have. And that's just very different. So the demographics very different. People are buying very different stuff than they did in the past. You mentioned less drinking. From what I understand, especially young men are gaming in now on Friday and Saturday nights rather than going out on dates. They're not drinking as much. So I heard somebody say one of the reasons they don't drink is because they're not going out as much, but also there's maybe the health benefits or the lack thereof. So very big seismic shifts. Me and my friends did not game on Friday or Saturday nights when I was young.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely behavioral differences, just less in-person gathering in general, which is maybe not great for your mental health. So you could say there's health benefit to drinking less, but if it's just because you're being isolated, you probably more than made up for the difference there. So
That's another podcast.
hopefully the kids are okay.
Yeah. So one of the things happen is older people are sticking around a lot longer. Lots of old people, and they're going to buy very different stuff than young people. And I'll throw this out there: when talking about demographics, matter quite a bit in our workforce too. The baby boomers were a massive cohort, and the average baby boomer is retiring right now or already has. And that's a big deal because the generations behind them aren't big enough. So when you talk about that inflation, one of the things we're going to see is inflation in labor. The United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, those are very much settler countries. So we can bring in immigration to solve some of our slow birth rate. Not every country can. We're seeing this all across the world. Japan, I think they said, is already hit this, but China is the fastest aging country in the world, and they say perhaps in history. So there's inflation from there. We're already seeing Mexico at even lower costs than China. So this is going to reposition our supply chains. It's not just going to impact CPGs in small ways; it's big ways now.
For sure. And there were some of the CPG companies really had huge problems with sourcing labor. Like the one that comes to mind the most for me is Tyson, where during the pandemic, they had a hard time getting people to show up to work at the meat processing plant when they got their stimulus checks. And they like made this big effort to see what people's sticking points were, why they weren't showing up to work. And in some cases, they were arranging transportation for those workers. And in other cases, they were setting up kind of daycares so that, because the issue was they didn't have anyone to watch the kids. That's why they weren't showing up. But all those things having a big impact for sure.
Yep. So we've talked about what the CPG is. We've talked about the inflation being just such a problem between them and the retailers and the private label brand growth. We've talked about the demographic shift, which is massive. And I got to think both of the inflation and the demographic shifts, these are cost problems for them. And I know that's given them a lot more need to look into what their transportation costs, because at this point, it's anything that can save me some money and let me be a little more competitive. So this is one of the reasons people are checking out Sonar, because it helps them buy better.
Yeah, exactly. Anytime they can reduce costs, I think they're going to try to do it. I would say freight costs are about maybe 8 to 10% of a typical CPG company's cost. So cost is certainly a factor, but also service is really critical too. You can imagine that if you go to a store for a certain category of product and it's not on the shelf, that you're going to buy something else. You're not going to go home empty-handed. So you can go from being a habitual customer of one brand to a habitual customer of another brand just because it wasn't on the shelf one day. So that's just speaks to just how critical that service levels are.
I can see that it's upset your son very much, the CPG challenges.
Maybe it's not having the cereal. That might be it.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, we all got cereal. Anyway, next thing I want to talk about is the omni-channel. Omni-channel just popped out of nowhere. So for a long time, if you're a CPG, you sold your stuff through Kroger or all these grocery stores, and there was these, but all of a sudden the big boxes developed. So that was new business, and I think they didn't. That wasn't probably a big challenge, but now they're being asked to sell online to some extent, maybe through Walmart.com or through Amazon or through their own website. All of a sudden, there's a whole bunch of places that they have to move inventory and manage inventory because some of this stuff goes bad. I take that back. Most CPG stuff is shelf-stable, right?
Yeah, most of it is shelf stable. Most of it's still sold through retail channels. I think what has changed a little bit is that some customers are just so used to buying just everything online. And there's been a great deal of success from certain direct to consumer companies. And those companies, if you come up with a certain niche, and then they've created a good website, a good value proposition where it circumvents the whole, we have to go to a store to buy something. Like one of the best examples was the Dollar Shave Club, which they just did direct to consumer there. And then all of a sudden people weren't going to the store to buy the Gillette razor, and a Dollar Shave Club ended up getting acquired by Unilever, but just huge success story of just circumventing the whole thing. And so for the established brands to compete, they feel like they need to have direct-to-consumer offerings too. They need to have just a very convenient shopping experience for customers also. They're getting a lot of help from retailers because they're trying to streamline the whole process in a lot of different ways too. Like Walmart has scan and go. Target has a lot of things where they'll just take the products out to your car and maybe let you return something and give you your Starbucks at the same time while your kid sleeps in the back seat. Just really make it convenient for parents with kids. But yeah, with the omni-channel, it's like ideally you would have one pool of inventory, and that inventory could be used for on-shelf purchases, direct to consumer, e-commerce through the retailer, e-commerce not through the retailer, and for multiple retailers, and just kind of have one pool of inventory. And therefore, that would really save a lot of costs from carrying. You don't want to have multiple pools and have too much inventory for Amazon, but not enough for Walmart or something. So that's created a huge logistical challenge.
You get punished if you don't have. So if you're selling through Amazon and you miss, you're like, oh, sorry, they wanted to buy this, but we didn't have it. You get marked down, and at a certain point, you start to lose your place on their marketplace. And we talked about the private labels. I think last time I looked, Amazon has 60 private label companies. And when you say, I just typed in, I'd like to buy that Mike's sweaters, and then surrounding it is all the private label things from Amazon saying, are you sure you want Mike's sweaters? Because we have something that is 30% cheaper. That is a real bummer.
Yeah, there's companies that have popped up specifically to help sellers on the Amazon marketplace navigate that, because they have to know all the nuances in terms of what size box you need, what they call the hero image, or what image needs to be on there that's going to get people to click, how to get your results up at the top, because no one's going to go to the third or fourth page to buy that product. So really have to game the system. Just if you're doing social media, you have to game that system. Same thing applies.
It feel like if you don't sponsor something, if you're selling sweaters, if you aren't one of the sponsored brands, I don't know how you win. You go to Amazon, a lot of times it's just the first page is all sponsored. By the way, sometimes I'm looking for something specific and I typed in exactly the words about the product. It's still at the very bottom of the page because all the sponsored stuff popped up front.
Yeah, for sure. It was a fascinating lawsuit by the Federal Trade Commission under the former FTC chairperson. It was really interesting. She wrote her thesis on how Amazon was exploiting that monopoly position and how all these different aspects of it reinforce. And really, it's like, it's not the consumer so much that's in a bad position from Amazon. It's really the sellers that are looking to sell into that Amazon marketplace, and very difficult to be profitable doing that. But you still have to be there. Otherwise, your competitors will sell against you, and they'll have all their bullet points of why their product is so much better than theirs. You at least have to be there to be part of that conversation.
Yeah. And so when you talk about omni-channel, I'm just talking about Diet Coke for a second. So when I go over to the store to buy Diet Coke at, say, Kroger or Walmart, wherever, they can have a display there, and it could be like a Super Bowl thing, and I can somehow feel part of the brand in some way. Now, when I buy it online, the customer experience is very different. Now, all it is I've clicked a button, and that's very different. And I think it's probably pretty scary if you built a brand over the last generation. How do I keep that brand alive in the omni-channel world? But I think also the idea that I now have a whole bunch of new outlets that I have to keep stocked, I would worry about the carrying cost of all my product.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That's an issue. And then the Coke that you're probably going to drink Diet Coke for the rest of your life, the younger generation probably doesn't want something different. So they have to have maybe more options for them.
Yes, exactly. My kids don't drink Diet Coke. They think it's disgusting. They drink some fancy water that costs more than my Diet Coke even. Mike, let's talk about SONAR. One more time, who's the sweet spot for SONAR, and what problem are you solving for them?
Yeah, so the core customers, we've seen a wide range. A lot of financial institutions will use it to refine their earnings expectations for companies and what they're going to report in the quarter. It interact with a lot of those companies that can see our data on a real-time basis. It helps them trade stocks. So that's one use case. Another use case is the carriers, because it shows which freight markets are hot, which are growing, where you want to send trucks into. Are you going to have loads that come back the other way? Carriers will use that as a tool to understand where they want to send their trucks and for network. And then another core group is the shipper community and brokers. And the shippers helps them understand how to position their RFPs, how aggressively they want to bid and establish their contractual rates. At one time, they want to have the best possible rate, but transportation rates don't have a lot of teeth. So they don't want to be too aggressive and have carriers not accept those loads. And so we show them where carriers are rejecting loads because they have higher rated spot activity. So those are the tender rejection data sets. So there's also a lot of rates in there, but also take the approach where we look at the tenders that shippers are offering. So basically the shippers' requests to move loads, the volume of those broken out every which way by region, and then are carriers accepting those loads or not, which gives you a little bit of a leading indicator of where spot rates are going, how aggressively carrier or shippers should be in their RFPs, and how they should think about modality, because we have a lot of intermodal data also.
Yep. Now, you mentioned tender rejection. Talk about that concept. And did you guys create that tender rejection metric? Is that part of SONAR?
Yeah, it's really one of the flagship offerings of SONAR. And so the concept is that because transportation contracts don't have a lot of teeth, that the carriers are going to reject contractual loads, request to move loads on the contract market because they have a better option on the spot markets. And so the shippers want to see where the carriers are rejecting those loads because it gives them an indication of just how tight the market is. And those tender rejections are going to rise and fall with spot rates. And the reason they're rejecting a load is that they have a better option on the spot market for the most part. And so we look at those every single day, and it gives you an indicator of where the published spot rates are going, and actually think of it as maybe a little bit better than just looking at the absolute spot rates, because the spot rates, like something that's posted on a load board, that's not necessarily the market clearing price. And because there's a lot of changes in the underlying costs of trucking transportation, like over the years, what's happened to insurance costs, right? Whereas if you just look at the tender rejection rate, the rate of the tenders that are being rejected, that gives you a sense, taking inflation out of the equation, how tight or loose the market is. And then look at that by region, by lane, really gives you a good indicator of where it's difficult to find a truck and where it's easy to find a truck.
Yeah. And I think tender rejection is probably something individuals looked at within companies for a long time. Hey, our tender rejections are going up. market's getting tighter, right? And if you're a carrier and times are bad, you are not going to reject your tenders, right? But as soon as there's, hey, I can get a load over here for $300 more. Why am I doing this one? So you reject it. But I think FreightWaves and SONAR are the first ones who said, we're going to give you that freight rejection rate for the industry, for every region, for every city. And I think that's super important because it gives everybody in the market a sense for what's going on. And I think we used to think of this data as this is for the carriers or this for the brokers. But I think in the last 5 years or so, it just feels like shippers have all of a sudden said, hey, if there's a whole bunch of analytics, we want them too.
Yeah, and for shippers, because the carrier, the tender rejection is the response, how the carriers are responding to the market. It's really a kind of a shipper tool because the shippers can see what the other side is doing.
Yeah. I got to tell you also, I've never worked for a big company, but I worked within them. So if you're working at one of the large automotive companies, they're used to having data on everything, and they're used to having reports on everything and KPIs on everything. And the idea that you don't understand what the market's doing, you only understand what you're being charged. Much better to say to the boss's boss when you get called into his office that, yes, the freight rates are going up, and I can show you on this graph from SONAR, and that's why we're paying more, not just because our 3PLs are taking advantage of us this week. And that's super important in those environments because first off, it's available. If it's available, give it to me.
Yeah, that is a significant use case of the SONAR product for sure.
Yep. All right, Mike, I'm going to try and wrap this bad boy up, and then I want to get your final thoughts on the topic. Then I want to talk about all the conferences we'll see you guys at. So talking to my friend Mike Baudendistel, I'll get it one of these days. We're talking about the CPG supply chain. So first off, we talked about what is the CPG supply chain, and it's those huge companies, mostly shelf-stable products that sell through grocery stores and Walmart, Costco, Trader Joe's. It's Coke, it's Pepsi, Anheuser-Busch, Nestlé, P&G, Unilever, big companies that we all know. And the CPG companies have had some struggles as of late because inflation, cost of labor has gone up. Right now, we didn't get into it too much, but we talked a little bit before we hit the record button about tariffs. We're disengaging somewhat from China in some regards because their costs have gone up. And so we have these global supply chains that have a little volatile. Costs might have gone up. We have labor shortage here in the United States and of all sorts of disruptions over the last, even before COVID, you said, right?
Yeah, that's right. And really the big thing now is the CPG companies are really concerned that these tariffs are going to cause their input costs to rise further because, I mean, they make the case that there's a lot of ingredients you can only get from one region of the country. So if you're just imposing a tariff there, it's not going to bring back jobs. It's just going to cause prices to increase.
And I think one of the reasons we're going to see these tariffs are going to be used to reposition supply chains. And I think we'll see that. I don't think the tariffs will be long for China, for Mexico or Canada. But if you're a supply chain guy, you have to do what's going on today. You can't trust what that dumbass Joe Lynch keeps saying. So anyway, getting back to it, inflation's been a big problem for them even before the current tariffs and even before COVID. And now they're battling against these private label brands that us consumers look and go, I don't notice a big difference. The private label brands have really exploded in places like Trader Joe's, maybe 80% of their product sales. So we also talk about the big demographic shifts and every generation buying differently as the baby boomers fade into history. Their kids and grandkids aren't buying the same way. They're not drinking as much. They're really concerned about the nutrition of their pet food. They're buying healthier food. Cereals maybe going away a little bit. Less baby food because we're having less babies. The GLP-1s like the Ozempics of the world, if that starts cutting off cravings, what's going to happen to all the junk food? And then the last thing we talked about is omni-channel. And the omni-channel is just one more, it's a beautiful thing because it's one more place to sell your stuff, but it's also challenging because you don't know how much you're going to sell in each of the channels you have. And then we talked about SONAR. So, Mike, put a big old bow on this one. Final thoughts on the topic.
CPGs are facing a lot of challenges, like you mentioned, coming from a lot of different angles, but they're still, I think, more stable companies than, despite all those challenges, more stable companies than most, because these are things that we buy every single day. It's not necessarily the first thing you're going to cut back on. In a cost of living crisis, you're more likely to not buy a new car or not buy, something that's really expensive. Maybe you don't go on the big vacation, but these kind of everyday items, sometimes they just make you feel good to get. You still have your Diet Coke and your Oreos, cookies, and the everyday items. So I think these companies will be fine. They're big cash generators, big dividend payers. So it's not a dire situation despite all these challenges that we walk through, but they do have some things they have to navigate.
Yep. And Mike, the reason they're still here is because of how good they've been over the last few generations. We didn't cover it, but there are tons of really famous consumer brands that are gone. There's a ton of really good retail brands or really well-known retail brands that are long gone. We've seen, we didn't talk about this either, but the CPGs, the Procter Gamble, Kraft Heinz, Unilever, Nestlé, these companies have acquired dozens and dozens of companies and then also got rid of these slow performers for a long time. They basically manage portfolios of companies. So these are the winners.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The ones that are the big multinational companies we've been talking about, very well managed, and they'll be interested to see what they introduce next.
Yep. So what conferences will we see you and the fine folks from FreightWaves at, Mike?
Yeah, so I would encourage everyone to go to live.freightwaves.com, and there's a list of events where you can mark your
Send me that link, Mike, and I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, sure. Live.freightwaves.com, and you go there, and a number of these are television events, so virtually only, but there are some in-person events, one of which is coming up here shortly is the Freight Fraud Symposium, which is a one-day event on May 14th in Dallas. So very targeted to those companies that have an issue with freight fraud, which might include some of the shippers, some of your listeners. Some of the others that are virtual be like the Small Fleet and Owner Operator Summit, Domestic Supply Chain Summit. There's an Enterprise Fleet Summit. Our big flagship conference is in Chattanooga. It's going to be this year on October 21st and 22nd. So call it a week and a half before Halloween in Chattanooga. And that's a 3 or 4 day conference, take over the whole downtown Chattanooga. It's a great place to go in the fall if you haven't been there.
Yes, I love it. I love it. So please send me the link to the conferences. And some of those summits are virtual, you said?
Yeah, some of them are virtual, some are in person. The two that we have on the books that are in person are the Freight Fraud Symposium in Dallas and then the Future of Freight Festival in October in Chattanooga. So I'd encourage you to do that, and also encourage you to go sonar.com, which you can request a demo for Sonar, but we also just have a lot of great content in terms of our blog and thoughts, including mine, on what's happening in the freight data, what's happening in the freight world.
Send me those links and I'll put them in the show notes so people can reach out and talk to you. I think it's very telling that you guys are doing something on freight fraud. As I said before, FreightWaves is the leader in this space. So if there's something going on, when we had COVID and it was a concern, you guys had your own podcast about it. You talked about it every single day. And now we have freight fraud. So I always think that FreightWaves is going to be that, not only just a news source saying, hey, this is a problem, but also saying, hey, here's the solution, and bringing those solution providers to you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Encourage people to do that. Yeah. Really appreciate the time, Joe.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really admire what you guys have done with the stock out, because again, a lot of people serve the CPGs and we all consume them, whether we like it or not. I don't think most of us have a sense for how their businesses go, especially as how they manage their supply chain. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was a great time.
And thank all of you for listening to my podcast. Your support is very much appreciated. Until next time, onward and upward.
You have been listening to the Logistics of Logistics podcast, where we engage with leaders in the logistics and supply chain community. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, hit the like button, and leave us a nice review on Apple or Spotify or wherever else you listen. Also, please check out our videos on YouTube and connect with us on LinkedIn. We're very big on LinkedIn. And you can also reach us on the logisticsoflogistics.com, our website.